Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. Good to see you all. So this is the first online satsang since the end of the latest retreat, which was a 6-day retreat held in Slovenia. And I felt it was, for me, a very rich and rewarding experience, and seems like the participants enjoyed it. So I wanted to probably go over some of the, or at least bring up some of the interesting points, or what I thought were interesting points that came up. It won't, there'll just be one or two of those. In a satsang that I thought what I would do is speak as if I was speaking to someone who hasn't come across the teaching before. Maybe someone who isn't even familiar with non-duality, because I'd like to make the point to anyone listening, even those who have listened to the teaching. I'll try to make the point that there is a logic, there is a reason, there's a rationale behind what is being said, and that a really hearing and understanding what is being said, instead of just either switching off, which obviously a lot of you guys don't do because you're interested in the topic and you sign in specifically to listen. But it's very easy for someone listening to an explanation of a topic to essentially not really hear what is being said, or it's heard, but not process it beyond the surface level understanding of what is being said. And in fact, what really needs to happen is implications. We need to start contemplating the implications of the framework. And the framework is really essentially just descriptions of life that are relevant for a particular topic, and in this case, the topic of happiness in daily living. So I thought if I talk about it as if I am speaking to someone who hasn't heard about it before, I'll make certain emphasis, and I think that might be useful. So the topic of the talk, what the talk is trying to contribute to, is the topic of, and it's not just a topic, but actual the practical manifestation of happiness in daily living for you, the person listening to this talk who is interested in the subject, or might be interested in the subject, as in this case, you might not have heard about it. It's something very intimate, happiness for the human being. It's not a concept. It's referring to the thing that we can't escape from, our life, daily life. We find ourselves waking up each morning, and there we are, thrown into life. It's inevitable and unavoidable. So that's what all of the concepts that follow are really in service of. They're talking about this topic of happiness in daily living. Now, some of the concepts that are going to be put forward will sound like they are, because they are talking about life, they might sound like they're meant to be definitive statements about how life actually is. And I would reiterate that the statements actually are always statements relative to the topic of happiness and daily living, which by default is happiness in life. And so some descriptions about life are made, some statements about life are made, but they're meant to be made, or they are made in relation to happiness in life. So an example of what I'm getting at is if I were to say everything in life is predetermined, everything in life will unfold exactly according to God's will. It might sound like I'm putting forward a theory of everything. It might sound like it is some explanation about that is valid for physics or philosophy. So that if the physicist actually understood this, or like Roger has said, everything is predetermined, everything will unfold exactly according to God's will. It's not meant to be a description of life from the perspective of everything. It's a description of life relative to the topic of happiness. That statement would hold no water in the field of physics. It shouldn't hold water in the field of physics. It isn't supported by the required process that is required for a theory, a physics theory, to come into existence and be accepted. It needs to be supported by mathematics, and I've presented no mathematics. It's not even meant to be a theory that is relevant as a philosophical theory. A philosophical theory needs to cover many bases, and I'm sure that some of the bases are not covered by the explanations I put forward. So remember, the statements are concepts, and a concept by default is relative, and it's not absolute. And furthermore, I'm not suggesting to you that you need to believe or even agree with the concepts I put forward. What I would say is that whatever I say, whatever anyone else has said in the past, and whatever anyone else might say in the future, be it a wise person, an intelligent person, or someone who's neither of those, whatever anyone has ever said or ever will say is always a concept and not the truth. It isn't possible to deliver truth in terms of in words which are by default concepts. So the use of the concepts is that they deliver information to the intellect that the intellect can then use if the concept becomes absorbed by the intellect. So this idea that I'm not asking anyone to believe the concepts or agree with the concepts is important. However, if the concepts are going to be useful, first they need to be understood intellectually. And then once they are understood intellectually, that intellectual understanding needs to find its way into our everyday life. What that means is that as we move through life, the concepts that we have understood intellectually can then start to pop up and confirm or be seen to be accurate relative to how things unfold. So let me just put in context what it means to understand a concept intellectually. I describe to someone who is going to visit my house when I'm not going to be there, I say, well, the front door has 3 latches or 2 latches and a lock. And you have to open the door in sequence. First, you have to pull the top latch down. The top latch is a latch that can be pulled down. And similarly, the bottom latch needs to be pulled up. Once you have pulled the top latch down first and then the bottom latch up, you then need to put the key into the lock and turn it to the right 3 times. At that point, the door should be free to open. So then I could say to the person, do you understand what I've just described? Which really means, do you have an intellectual understanding of what I've just described? They haven't seen the door, they haven't seen the latches. My descriptions might actually be misguided or inaccurate, but that will become noticeable to them when they are in the actual situation. So at this point, they might say, yes, I understand intellectually. You have said first to pull down the top latch, that is the first of 2 latches. Then I am to pull up the second latch. And once the top latch and the bottom latch have both been opened in that order, I am to put the key in and turn it 3 times to the right. And I say, do you understand what a key is? Yes, I very much understand what a key is. And do you understand how a key works, that you have to turn it in order for the internal? Yes, I understand. So I understand what you have said intellectually. There is nothing there that baffles me, the person might respond. So they then find themselves in front of the door. And they look at the door and they go, the concept seems accurate, at least so far. There are 2 latches, one at the top, one at the bottom. Pulls the top one down, and he further confirms the concept. The top latch seems to be able to be pulled down without unlocking anything or shifting any other pieces of the mechanism. So far, yes, the concept is accurate in practice, and goes to unlock the bottom latch, and then puts the key in, turns it 3 times, and the door then is free to open, and it opens. So the person says, not only do I understand the concept intellectually, but based on my own experience, the concept is accurate. And as the person opens the door multiple times, the intellectual understanding is no longer necessary. It converts from an intellectual understanding into what we could say a deeper understanding of how the door and the locks work. It's not something that the intellectual understanding isn't something that needs to be referenced every time the door is needs to be unlocked. In the same way as when we become very familiar, more than just an intellectual understanding that we have a name, we don't need to refer back when we hear a name, Roger. Go, Roger. Oh, I think that's my name. My name, therefore I have to respond to the person. It all happens automatically because it is deeply understood from my own experience that my name is Roger. And so it's not an intellectual understanding. It is started off as an intellectual understanding, and that then went deeper and deeper and deeper. And that is what can happen in relation to the whole framework that is put forward, such that we find that the internal structures of the human being, so we could say the neural network is one way of describing it. The neural network changes form as the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, and by default we find there is a change in the way we move in life, not necessarily on a biological level, because the concepts are often not focused on the biological aspect of the human being, but more so on the what the teaching would call the psychological response, the attitude to life. And that attitude is very important in relation to human happiness. And we'll look at why that is very shortly. The explanations will elaborate on why a change on the level of attitude is so important. So if the intellectual understanding just remains intellectual, it isn't something that we find arising over and over again in our own life experience, to essentially remind us of the new explanation of what is going on in life. If that doesn't happen, it's pretty certain that the required changes inside the system are not going to be made, and so essentially the structure will remain the same, and the response to life, the way that one feels in life on, you could say, a level of the psychological self or on the level of self, will remain more or less the same as it was previously. So what we need to find, or if we find that the concepts keep arising throughout our day, then that is a great sign that the understanding is going deeper and deeper and deeper, and then we might see corresponding changes in the internal state in relation to outcomes in life. That's we'll also talk about that. So given this is a talk about happiness and all of the concepts follow on from that, we should make some comments. So the framework will make some comments about the topic of happiness. One comment is that happiness is available to everyone. It's our birthright. That doesn't mean that it will set in for everyone, but it does mean something very particular. It's our birthright to be happy. So if someone is born to a certain family, and a royal family, then we might say it is their birthright to be the king. They would, whereas someone who isn't born into a certain family doesn't have that birthright to one day become king. If a son of a king is born, it might be their birthright to be king one day, but circumstance might not conspire such that they do become king. They might be the second-born son, and the first-born son might become king, and he might outlive the second-born son, whose birthright it always also was to be king. However, someone who wasn't born in the family is missing something to enable them to become king. They're missing the birthright. So the good news is that it is our birthright, everyone's birthright, to be happy. No one is missing anything. No one is lacking anything to enable them to be happy. Now, the circumstance, the situation may not be conspiring at this particular point in time, but it's very good to know that the potential is there for everyone. And what does happiness in daily living for the human being actually look like in practical terms? So these concepts are meant to be practical. They're designed to approach the situation from the ground upwards. There are other teachings that approach the situation from the top downwards. Now, as their methodology. So eventually, even if we start at the ground and move up, the top layers of the topic, which turn out to be the more esoteric aspects of the human being, eventually get addressed and revealed through the bottom-up process. And similarly, the top-down process, which starts off by looking at the esoteric aspects and doesn't focus on the practical daily living aspects, a top-down teaching that starts off looking at the esoteric aspects eventually will inevitably lead to a revelation of the practical. They're just different methodologies that take a different approach and start one bottom moving upwards and the other top moving downwards. So this, being a bottom-up approach, delivers concepts that, one, should be understandable based on your own experience, and are testable, are able to be observed, whereas some of the top-down esoteric concepts that talk about the more abstract aspects of the human being are sometimes harder to observe based on one's own experience. Now, that's not to say one is better than the other. That's just a fact of the different methodologies, and they each have their place. It isn't about one being better than the other. Depending on the temperament of the person, the practical might be more suited to some people than the esoteric, and vice versa. So an example of a practical concept, which is a description of how things are, is that the flow of life, meaning where you find or the experience as you move through the day. Life is always experience, and life is always either pleasure or pain. So if you find yourself stubbing your toe on a table leg as you walk past it, you could say that is the flow of life in that moment, and it is pain in the moment. And if someone offers you a nice piece of fruit and you taste it, you eat it and you taste it, that is the flow of life in the moment, and it is pleasure in the moment. What determines whether the moment, the flow of life in the moment is pleasure or pain, that is determined by the circumstance, and whether the circumstance is in line with your biological preferences or not in line with your biological preferences. So if your biological preference in that moment is a preference for sweet food and the fruit is sweet, then you would say that's pleasure in the moment. If your biological preference is not to have sour fruit, and the fruit is sour, then it's not in line with your biological preference, and so you would say that is pain in the moment. The pleasure and pains that we have, we could break into 3 different categories: physical pleasure and pain, emotional pleasure and pain, financial pleasure and pain. So an example of financial pain would be if you were to drop 50 euros or $50 out of your pocket accidentally, and then when you get to the shop and you need to pay for your groceries, you realize that you must have dropped or lost the money, and there is it's not in line with your biological preference, so there is biological pain. If you put your hand into your pocket and realize that you've got extra money that was left in your pocket from a year ago, that's financial pleasure in the moment. And it doesn't have to be as specific to finding notes in, or extra notes in your pocket, or losing notes in your pocket. If you need to, if you were going to get a contract and then the person cancels the contract, that's financial pain. If an airline ticket that you wanted to buy drops in price from the price you thought you were going to pay, then that's financial pleasure, and on it goes. And an example of physical pleasure is the fruit in line with your biological preference. If the day is very hot, and you could say that's physical pain if it's beyond what your biological preference is. Emotional pleasure and pain is if I'm told that I'm not a very good friend, then there is going to be a response in my system. It's not what I would prefer to hear. It'd be much nicer if the friend said, you know, you're a really great friend. I really appreciate it, and I just wanted to tell you that. One is going to feel more pleasurable than the other, in line with my biological preferences. Now, whether we take that personally or not, whether there is suffering as a result of any of those circumstances, is a separate issue on top of the base pleasure or pain in the flow of life. Anyway, that was just an example of concepts that are practical concepts that can be understood intellectually, assuming the descriptions are put forward well enough. And you, as you go through your life and you stub your toe, the thought might arise, pain in the moment, not circumstance that interacts with the biological, the body, and produces a response that is either in line with my preference or not in line with my preference. So we can see that these concepts are confirmable. So happiness is available, it's our birthright. What is happiness in practical terms? It turns out that happiness in practical terms is very different from the idea, the belief, the deeply ingrained belief that we tend to have about happiness. The idea we have about happiness is that happiness is a result of pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And because that's what we believe our happiness comes from, being on holiday, seeing friends, doing exciting things, eating good food, money, fame, that life that has put that belief in place, meaning we have, as by default as human beings, when we're born, we develop more or less by default and more or less in a consistent way across, not relatively consistent across each human. And it's not something that we do, it's something that happens. The development happens. And so life essentially puts in place this structure of belief around happiness. And it says, my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 pleasure to be found in the future, things that I don't currently have. And that conclusion, if we needed to explain it, is because by default, we don't feel happy as human beings in a way that intuitively maybe we know we can. And because we don't feel it, we conclude something is missing. And the most obvious are the gross aspects of life, outcomes. And outcomes are either pleasure or pain. And so the assumption is, I feel this, something is missing, something is wrong. that I don't have the happiness that is available, and therefore we put in place this movement outward towards things in the future, towards outcomes. And whether we realize it or not, the standard belief is happiness is to be found through pleasure. So that's a description that we hopefully we look inwards and we ask ourselves, is it true that I have the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes? Is it true that I have this deeply ingrained belief that says an outcome or circumstance in life actually is an attack or an addition to who I am? That I am more complete if things go a particular way than going the less ideal way. And we can use our reactions, the responses that arise inside our system as evidence towards whether we have this deeply ingrained belief. So if in the face of certain circumstances, let's say pain, we find ourselves responding a particular way, we might be able to see that response clearly demonstrates that my belief is that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So that's something very, very valuable for the seeker to have consciously become aware of. So the descriptions here are descriptions of what is, often things that we haven't, our attention hasn't landed on. So what is the happiness that is available in life if it is not happiness through outcomes? It turns out that what is available on a continuous, unbroken basis, so that means a happiness that is able to set in and remain consistently there. Turns out that happiness is the same as peace of mind, which means happiness through peace of mind, or happiness in the form of peace of mind. So we can drop the word happiness and just say it is our birthright to have peace of mind, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of circumstance. Why it might be useful to drop the word happiness, although at some point in the seeking, I think it's very useful to pick it back up with the very clear definition of what happiness is. But at first, it might be useful to drop the word happiness because happiness has been so deeply ingrained in our outlook as being something related to feelings of pleasure, excitement, joy, love, good food, relaxation. And so we say, I'm happy when I have those things. And so happy has this vibrant, excited correlation built into it. So we might say, I'm not looking for happiness. What I'm looking for is peace of mind. That's if we have come to understand, yes, that is what is available. Not just because the concept says it, but because an investigation has happened, meaning awareness and the intellect has started to investigate our own internal beliefs and seeing how getting happiness getting pleasure doesn't deliver an ongoing, unbroken happiness. So we have to use the evidence from our own life to help bring about a very clear, a clarity around the topic, a clarity such that we don't find ourselves being having the wool pulled over our eyes time and time again. And that's why having an intellectual understanding is really not enough. An intellectual understanding, if it weren't to arise over and over, would be something you maybe had a discussion about 10 years ago or a year ago, and then didn't think much about it afterwards. And that, so someone, we might have had a discussion and concluded, oh yeah, that makes sense. Maybe happiness is peace of mind. That's interesting. I've always, directed my life or tried to structure life, trying to find happiness through something else. Oh, that's an interesting point. So it's understood intellectually in that discussion. And if there's no further contemplation about it, it's as if it never happened, or that understanding is really not going to deliver any practical changes. So if we find our relationship to pleasure and pain changing because something in the system now says, oh, there's the attitude of attachment. That's what we can call the attitude that is based on the deeply ingrained belief that happiness is to be found in pleasure, in outcomes, in the future. The attitude of attachment to outcomes. So if that starts being seen each time it is triggered, then what we might find is that there is a cutting off of the reaction to pain being delivered. There is a cutting off of the incessant thinking that is driven by this idea happiness is to be found in the future. And as that cutting off happens more and more, we start to get our own evidence, our own glimpses that peace of mind is underneath that incessant seeking for pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. That we start to see that there is this other state, this other dimension, this other gear, you could say, that life can be lived from, where even in the face of pain, if the involvement, the attitude of attachment to outcome gets cut off, we find ourselves dropping back into a place that we now might start to call, oh, this is home. Find ourselves dropping into a place where there is peace, regardless of the fact that a friend has let us down, regardless of the fact that the body is sick and can't do some of the things we might like it to be doing, regardless of the fact that there was financial pain in the moment. It is possible for us to find a cutting off of that involvement that we were so familiar with, and then have access to a dimension of the human being that in itself is already complete and is by its nature peaceful. So if those moments start presenting, we can put ticks next to the concept. Happiness is available, but it's available in the form of peace of mind. And what's another description or explanation of what peace of mind really is? It turns out that peace of mind is the absence of suffering. And suffering is unhappiness. So happiness is just the absence of unhappiness. Happiness is just the absence, the non-arising of unhappiness. So if peace of mind is the absence of suffering, what is suffering? Suffering is not the pleasure or pain in the flow of life. Suffering is not the stubbing of one's toe on the table leg, and it's not the subsequent pain that is felt as a physical experience. That is pain. Suffering in this context is a word used to describe something very different to pain. Pleasure and pain is inevitable and is not going to magically stop. This process that is termed enlightenment, and that has its problems. So enlightenment, which in this framework just means change that has led to happiness for the human being setting in. Happiness that, as described, takes the form of continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. That state is not magically going to mean no more pain ever arises in your life. So if suffering is not pain, and if peace is not to be found, or happiness, whichever way you want to look at it, is not to be found by life being pleasure, 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 what is this layer, this dimension that is clearly different to circumstantial pleasure or pain? So that dimension of suffering is, and peace of mind, when the suffering dissolves, is always attitudinal. Attitudinal, what does that mean? It means what attitude is there that arises? Attitude to what? Attitude to the inevitable flow of life, the inevitable circumstance that we always find ourselves in. And what is circumstance from a biological point of view? It is either pleasure or pain, depending on whether the circumstance is in line with our biological preferences. So suffering is and peace of mind is the attitude to the inevitable flow of life. And what is the attitude that leads to suffering? In this framework, it is the attitude of personal doership and the coexisting attitude of attachment to outcome. So, we could be talking about all sorts of concepts in life, how to make scrambled eggs, the best insulation for a house. They're not relevant to the topic of happiness in daily living. So they don't get spoken about. So the topics the topics that are relevant do get spoken about and elaborated on. So we're now at the point of, what are we really looking for in life? Whether we realize it or not, we're looking for happiness. We have an idea that is wrong. We have the idea happiness is to be found in outcomes. It turns out that happiness is available, but it's available through peace of mind, and peace of mind is not to be found on the level of circumstance. And similarly, suffering isn't to be found on the level of circumstance. So we've now come to the point that says suffering is always got to do with our attitude to circumstance. And what is the attitude in practical terms that leads to an attitude that turns into suffering or is experienced as suffering? And suffering is an extra load, very uncomfortable load, that is a good word to describe suffering, when we really feel it, when we really start to look at it and confirm the concepts, uncomfortableness with oneself, really. Uncomfortableness with oneself that sometimes takes on the form of uncomfortableness with the other. But when we dive into uncomfortableness with the other, we'll find it's really an uncomfortableness with oneself. So that uncomfortableness is an extra load on top of the inevitable pleasure or pain in circumstance. And because that attitude to circumstance is indistinguishable at first from the circumstance itself, because the attitude kicks in because the beliefs are so deeply ingrained, and they have in fact become what we can call the psychological self, meaning how we know ourselves because of these deeply ingrained ideas, which turns out to be, unfortunately, ignorance of the self that has the effect of superseding or covering up the real self. And the real self, the nature of the real self, happens to be the very place where unexplainable peace comes from. So the covering up of the self means the peace which is our birthright and which essentially is our essence, our nature, is not available because the psychological self, this deeply ingrained set of beliefs about who we are and what we need in order to be complete, that I've just suggested, is actually a misguided and erroneous set of deeply ingrained beliefs. They form the psychological self, and the psychological self responds instantaneously to circumstance as it presents itself. And so what is experienced by a human being is the pain of circumstance, if it's painful, or the pleasure of circumstance, with the simultaneous involvement of the psychological self in that circumstance. And so there is this bundle of pleasure and pain and attachment or doership. And it is not discernible as two different movements, two different layers, one biological and one psychological. It becomes discernible as we start following the guideline, the guide rope of the concepts that are being put forward here. And the recognition that there are these essentially two different and quite distinct layers to our experience is groundbreaking and is essential for a witnessing to kick in at some point, and we can talk more about that. Unless a clarity sets in about the fact that there is the inevitable layer of circumstance, which is always pleasurable or painful, and it's our destiny as to whether in each moment we will experience pleasure or pain. Another way of saying that is it's ultimately not in our control. When it becomes apparent that there's that layer, and then there is another layer which is internally generated, and we call the attitude to circumstance. And when the attitude is coming from that psychological self, that is essentially the belief in personal doership and the belief in what we call attachment to outcome, which means the belief that outcomes in the future are what will eventually make me complete and whole, then the load that is added on top of the circumstance is a load of guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation. More fully, just to add in some extra detail, guilt or shame, blame/hatred, or blame and hatred, they are the same, two ways of describing the same thing. Same with guilt and shame, blame and hatred, pride and arrogance. There is worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. And all of those forms of suffering are either felt in the body as a sensation, or exist as a narrative. For example, blame. You, the other, you hurt me by delivering pain, by not delivering pleasure. You hurt me, I hate you. And that narrative extends horizontally in time and can play over and over and over and can remain in place for a whole lifetime. It is an uncomfortableness with the other, which really is an uncomfortableness with oneself, stemming from the belief in personal doership and the belief in attachment to outcome, which, as I mentioned, formed the psychological self. And the psychological self is an error because the beliefs at its core are erroneous. What do I mean by the beliefs at the core are erroneous? The concept in this teaching says we are not the doer. The other is not the doer. The belief that gets put in place by life as part of our development at a very young age says, I am the doer. I am the one that is the source of my thoughts, the source of my actions and my emotions and my words. I am the source of my skills, of my good points and my bad points. Not that there would be a clarity around all of those components of the self at the time when there is this mistake, which really comes from a lack of clarity, this belief in personal doership. But unconsciously, this attitude of personal doership is an attitude towards all of those things, an attitude to the words coming out of our mouth, the thoughts arising in our head, the emotions that arise, the feelings that arise, the behaviors, the actions, and the outcomes. My doing, your doing. Which really means that psychologically, or the way we are seeing ourselves and seeing the other, is as separate, independent objects or subjects in life. It is essentially a psychological separation that happens when this belief gets set in place. And the belief gets set in place because from a young age, and even as we're older, there's a rather crude assessment of the world, and that assessment is based on this, primarily based on the senses. And a physical, just the visual sense creates this, there are very hard boundaries. And then other objects from a physical point of view have their hard boundaries. And then there's what seems like space in between the boundaries. So the assessment is, we're separate. And if we're separate and things are happening, I must be independent. Independent and separate are very intertwined notions. A more nuanced assessment would start to reveal that the separation that is there when we look at it just from a visual perspective is not really there. The fact that we can be affected by someone's words, we are influenced by words, words can create pleasure or pain. It means that a word connects to us, which means we're not separate. It means the other, because it's words from the other that connect to us. If we were separate, their words couldn't connect to us. We, once again, from a more less subtle or less nuanced approach, using just the senses, the only time we would say we're connected is if the other person physically holds our arm, and then there is a physical connection supported by the visual field and the sense of touch. We need to go beyond this crude notion of connection and realize that from the moment of conception, when the sperm and the egg come together, the entity, the physical entity, is always influenced by its environment. And not only influenced by physical components of the environment, but by all sorts of components. So an example might be if the parent is anxious, the entity might be able to absorb or feel that anxiety. Once we are born and essentially no longer physically connected to the mother or the other, we see that we continue as a physical entity, a baby, let's say, which is the natural development that the baby didn't control and the mother doesn't control. So the natural development that happens in life, from sperm to egg to fetus and then to baby and then on to the various stages of development, that entity is always being influenced by the environment it's in. And of particular note are the concepts, the beliefs, what we can call part of the new conditioning that is continuously delivered to the biological, psychological entity. And so our development that continues to happen moment after moment, day after day, we grow into a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, etc., is a result of the genetic structure and the simultaneous, unavoidable, inevitable new conditioning that continues to happen moment after moment after moment throughout life. So what is this human being that finds itself in circumstance and finds itself reacting, responding to the circumstance based on its biological and psychological structure? It's a biological robot, a biological machine designed by God or designed by life. Not designed by itself and not its progress or its development. Each human being's development happens in spite of what we might like to happen. It happens one way. And so the human being is essentially this very complex biological robot. And as part of the biological structure, the brain, if we take the very practical bottom-up approach where we, let's say, adopt materialism as the model in which we are talking. And remember, again, it doesn't matter. There isn't a model out there that is proven to be the reality of things. And we could make the same arguments if we took up any of the other credible models that exist. So I'm just deciding from the bottom-up approach to use the standard materialism model that works on the notion that life is a physical reality and unfolds according to laws of cause and effect and laws of physics. And I'm not saying that that's the truth of life. I'm saying we need to see life within a certain context, and the materialist context is the one that appears from a surface look. And if someone wanted the same topic of happiness in daily living described from within a different model of reality, a different any of the models that currently have some credence to them or some following, the same points could be made, just using slightly different support. And so the point that's being made here is we are not the doers, and I'm using a causal explanation to show that we're not the doers. And the causal explanation includes this notion of a brain that thinks and a sperm and an egg that grow, because to ignore that, given that's how things appear, would there'd be very good, would need very good reason to do that. Mind you, I'll talk about the non-duality perspective that says consciousness is primary and the physical world is secondary. The materialist view says the material world is primary. Knowing which one is true, and there is no evidence to support either one as true. They're just you have to run with your intuition or your whatever satisfies you the best, and then understand the topic of happiness within that model. And it's explainable, I can assure you, without needing to know which model is true. So going back to the human being, we are essentially very complex entities that respond exactly according to their structure, just like the calculator has been built and programmed. And so if the operator puts 4 + 4 into the calculator and presses equal, the calculator has no option but to function and deliver the answer 8, assuming it has been built and programmed in line with the structures and programs that most calculators are built to. It's not optional. The calculator can't decide, oh, I'm going to trick this person and spit out 10. It's just not possible for 10 to appear on the screen unless there is what we would call a malfunction in the calculator, which means some of the circuitry is broken or something like that, or the LCD display is broken that creates a different answer. And so the human, to take two chemicals that come in contact with each other, they each have a very specific structure, and there will be a response, a reaction that is outside of the individual chemicals' control. They don't sit there and have a conference as to how they're going to react to each other. It happens, and there is no option. It is not up for debate. It's a happening according to God's will, you could say, or a happening according to cosmic law, a happening according to the determined nature of the materialist model. And so just to give you an example about how the models aren't so important, someone who doesn't take a materialist point of view, or at least a more nuanced materialist point of view, if they include notion of quantum physics, which is essentially the realm of physics that is operated by different rules to the physical world, the Newtonian layer of physics, and then the quantum runs by, and so someone would say, you say everything is predetermined because A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, and that everything was set in place just like the balls on a billiard table or on a snooker table will all move and end up in exactly one position based on the force and angle that the white ball hits those other balls. And so from a materialist point of view, everything is predetermined even before the balls come to their final resting spot. A computer, if it had the information of how the white ball was going to be hit, with what force and at what angle, then it could tell you where the balls are going to end up with 100% accuracy before the balls have ended up being there. So it should be clear intellectually that everything is predetermined on the level of physical unfolding according to the laws of materiality. So someone would say, yes, but what about the quantum rules? Quantum rules don't follow causality. There is an element of randomness. So your notion that everything is predetermined is inaccurate. Let's go back to why we're talking about this in the first place. And it's got to do with doership and attachment to outcome. And so we're talking about doership. I believe I'm the doer when we start off in life, and eventually it can become clear I am not the doer. One of the rationales that can be used to undo the belief in personal doership is this predetermined nature that dictates where the balls will end up. The ball might think that they are deciding to bump into the cushion, deciding to hit another ball and end up in their position, in their final position, but that would just be an erroneous interpretation of what's happening. So if we run with the fact that things happen randomly, that doesn't suddenly mean, oh, I am the doer. It's another way of looking things, another way of looking at the mechanisms, or another explanation for the mechanisms of what happened. And that explanation doesn't give us doership either, or doesn't support doership either. So let's stick with the material. The human is a very complex biological, psychological entity that finds itself in life and essentially reacts one way to the circumstance. That reaction is whatever it is. And the point of the teaching is not to say you should react well or react in a way that delivers pleasure to society, or to say you should react in a way that delivers pain to society. That's not the point. The point is you will react. Everyone is always reacting or responding. It's not about, responding is better than reacting. They're just two different words that I'm using to use to describe the movements of people in life. So my speaking is essentially a response, a reaction to the fact that a satsang is happening. That's the circumstance. And I'm not in control of these words and the actions. I laugh sometimes, my hands are always moving. And I witness the hands moving, and I say, who's doing it? It's definitely happening. And in a certain situation, I might act bravely, or I might act cowardly. I might act kindly or unkindly. I might laugh or I might get angry. And the point is not which one I should do. That's what the doer that is attached to outcome wants to think. It says, because of the psychological self, it says you should act kindly, bravely. You should laugh and not be angry. Clarity is to say, well, actually, life happens. And it happens according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning based on the descriptions just put forward. Genes and up-to-date conditioning, that is a way of saying the physical and the conditioning that happened moment after moment after moment. More, if we were to follow a more scientific or medical explanation, it would be called epigenetics. And that determines the epigenetics, or this explanation. Maybe it isn't even covered by epigenetics. If you go into the science explanation, they might have all sorts of other factors. In this framework, the word genes and up-to-date conditioning encompasses, or that they're the two factors, the two variables that determine, and no other variable exists. If you can find another variable, on further investigation, I would suggest you'd find it is either genes or up-to-date conditioning. So they are the two variables that determine our structure, and our structure, depending on the circumstance, this depends on or determines how we will act. And the attitude of non-doership is understanding this deeply. Understanding that there is no option once it's happened, then the idea, oh, I should have acted differently, is basically demonstrating a misunderstanding of the mechanism by which the action happened. It's like saying, the toaster should make me orange juice. It's not designed to make you orange juice. And so in a particular moment, if the circumstance, which is very particular, right? It includes a lot of different variables in a circumstance. And so it's very hard to replicate a circumstance exactly. So each circumstance is unique. And then in that moment, our genes and up-to-date conditioning are unique, and there is a response. And if we have really contemplated this and find there is no third factor, then the thought that arises that says, oh, I should have acted differently, is seen to be complete ignorance. If the circumstance was different, there would have potentially been a different response. If the genes and up-to-date conditioning was different, then there would have been a different response. But the fact is, it was what it is, or it was what it was, and the outcome is what it is. So with this understanding, this attitude, a lot of the suffering that takes the form of guilt, blame and pride, complaining, regret, expectation in the future just falls away. It becomes clear that life is an unfolding according to God's will. Life has always been an unfolding according to God's will. There never has been a doer, and there never will be a doer. The belief in personal doership is something that life has actually put into us. So the attitude of personal doership is an impersonal happening in itself. The attitude of personal doership doesn't magically bring a doer into existence. It simply isn't possible for there to be a doer. Because everyone is always functioning according to their genes and up-to-date conditioning. The belief in personal doership is the belief that gets in place when that explanation or that way of seeing things hasn't been delivered by life, and the 2-year-old, the 3-year-old simply do not process on that level, and parents don't talk to 2-year-olds, and nor should they, in that sort of rationale. And that's why the misunderstanding, because life is, and all of the analysis and conclusions are put in place based on the more gross interpretations, and because the intellect's not very developed and the psychology's not very developed, then these errors get put in place, and those errors then don't get corrected until such time as someone usually becomes a seeker and these topics are spoken about. So we really need to bring attention to the fact that we're looking for happiness, and happiness is what is there when unhappiness falls away. And if we look at the unhappiness, which is a very important thing to do, because if we're honest, we say, well, actually, I don't know what happiness is. I don't have it. I can rely on your concept, but it's very hard for me to test it because it's not my experience, a seeker might say. Okay, good. So the critical thinking aspect, at least if the seeker said that, there's a critical thinking aspect that means the seeker is not willing to just believe a concept. That's great. So where do we start? I'd suggest, and this was something Ramesh, a lot of the talk is inspired by what Ramesh would put forward in his daily talks. Ramesh would say, when you can put your hand on your heart in a particular moment and say, in this moment, I'm not happy. Other moments I'm not so sure about, but in this moment, I know I'm not happy. Investigate that. And what we'll find is that there is an attitude of doership or attachment to outcome manifesting in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation. And under those various headings, they're sort of drop-down menus, and there's many different forms of blame, for example. And as we investigate it, as we look, we will start to understand the different forms of those, or the different subsets of those broad categories of suffering. That becomes a very useful thing. Then we know, I know what my unhappiness is. Next time we can put our hand on our heart, we go, in this moment, I know I'm not happy. Look, see what it is, and we'll find once again, the unhappiness is the attitude to circumstance, attitude of guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation. And when we look at the attitude that is happening, we'll see it is based on the belief I am the doer, the other is the doer. And the story is, I should have done it differently. I hate myself for not having done it differently, and now the outcome being this. Or you should have functioned differently. You're my friend. You shouldn't have done this. You shouldn't have hurt me in this way. I hate you for what you've done to me. And you'll see that it's saying that you, my friend, are a separate, independent entity. It's projecting this idea that that friend could have acted differently in the circumstance. So Ramesh would say, with this attitude, when pleasure or pain is delivered, it's understood to be destiny unfolding, that which is inevitable and unavoidable. My destiny being delivered. And if pain is delivered through another, then the attitude is, it was my destiny to experience this pain, and it was the destiny of the other to be the vehicle through which the pain was delivered. And that means the other is no longer the enemy. The other is just a messenger or a delivery system. The hatred for the other now no longer has a basis on which to arise. If I see that my action that delivered pain to the other or pain to myself through an outcome that is not preferable, if I see that that is destiny unfolding, then hatred towards myself no longer has a basis to arise, and no longer has a basis to arise from. And pride is similarly, it is the belief of personal doership, but in relation to outcomes that happened through me that were favorable. And then the belief in personal, look what I achieved. I, as the doer, I hope everyone appreciates me. And pride comes before the fall, which means the psychological identity from which pride exists is the psychological identity that is going to hate itself when inevitably the outcomes in life are not favorable. And this attachment to outcome, the deeply ingrained belief that the best we can have is pleasure, that that's really what life is, pleasure or pain. And so as part of this development, there is the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, which, if that's not our nature, right? If that is just the biological dimension, that pleasure and pain are of the physical dimension, then that might be, and in the teaching it says it is, a misunderstanding about who we are. But for as long as the attitude continues to be an attitude of my happiness is pleasure, 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 then when the other delivers pain, what the other is delivering is not only pain, but a perceived attack on self. So we have to hate them. Not only you hurt me, but you've attacked me. You have taken away what I believe is my completeness, my happiness. You have delivered pain, not pleasure. So that's why it's very important to come in contact with a deeper aspect of self that then ties in with the changing intellectual ideas that are going deeper and deeper. And earlier on, I said that what we are is a biological machine, a biological robot. And what I was talking about then was the mechanical side of the human being, that from which the speaking is mechanical, the thinking is mechanical. We might not appreciate it, but it's essentially a movement within a electromagnetic movements in a neural network. The body, has pipes and filters and pumps and computers. So the brain is the computer, the heart is a pump, the kidneys are filters, the blood vessels are like pipes. We ingest food, which is fuel. We store unused fuel as reserves of fuel. There are excretory systems to get rid of waste. It sounds very much like a car, or a machine, because it is. It's just not a metal one, it's a biological one. And if we start to appreciate the mechanical movements, then they get put into their place. And those are the actions, including the thoughts and the emotions. Once again, thoughts don't seem like mechanical outputs, but as we think about them more and more, contemplate the mechanism, we might start to see that the thought is an output of a physical entity, a physical system, the brain, which is part of a subset of the larger physical machine. And so all of these things, whether we sing well or we have certain personality, all of that can be attributed to the biological side of things, biological / psychological. So the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome is part of the body, but it is a category that we call the psychological self. It is ideas about who we are. And they're not functional ideas, they're ideas on the level of self. So functional ideas would be, let's say, what we call the working mind versus the thinking mind. The working mind is an understanding, let's say, that the body is a biological instrument. The psychological idea is, I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So now we can introduce the descriptions about the non-biological, the non-psychological aspect of the human being. So in doing that, what is the description, what is the definition of a human being in this framework? So remember, these are all concepts according to this framework. In another framework, the concepts will be different. So according to this framework, a human being is impersonal consciousness of source, linked to a particular body-mind organism, and then functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. The impersonal consciousness of source that links to or identifies with, so it's the consciousness of God or source. And in the manifestation created by source, we don't, and source is it's a placeholder. If you don't have a specific idea of source, which probably is a healthy position to have, because usually the specific ideas of source are heavily conditioned and often not coming from society that has that much insight or clarity or wisdom. So source is a placeholder name for who knows what. Life. Where did life come from? Source. So the consciousness of source, life, God, has embodied or has linked to and is functioning through that instrument as personal consciousness. Personal consciousness means the consciousness linked, or the conscious experience that is unique to each individual human being or each individual body instrument, which means your life experience that is, which is all you've ever had, moment after moment after moment, is the personal consciousness experience. And that is possible because the impersonal consciousness of source has linked to the body, and that is the component that is not mechanical, not psychological. And the mechanical, or identification with the mechanical movements, the actions, the outcomes, the behaviors, the thoughts, the emotions, the feelings, as mine, is what keeps us unaware of our connection to source. And the word connection can be a bit misleading. It implies two that connect to each other, but a more open-minded relationship to the word connection might mean the same as a realization that the personal consciousness experience that I've always said is my experience, that is from me a separate independent entity, may be not separate from, and as a result of, that which is not separate from God or source. So we might have this wonder of, how does God experience life, or how does life or source experience life? And so we might imagine life, God, having this CCTV set up with billions of monitors where it, is seeing everyone's experience of life. And one fine day it might dawn on us that God is aware of life through each of us, which is, my experience is God's experience. God doesn't have some other experience out there of life. We are the instruments, or the body is the instrument through which God functions. If you don't like the word God, which I can understand, because that too is a loaded term, and it's what you might not like about God is probably not what I am including in my understanding of God, which is why I say we can say life, source, consciousness. The God, life, source is experiencing life through each of us. Prior to human beings and animals coming into existence in the manifestation, so let's say consciousness or source was in its potential form, not creating, and then it explodes into manifestation, into that which exists within the framework of time and space, which didn't exist prior to manifestation. So in its potential form, even the framework of time and space hadn't come into existence. And then potential energy becomes manifest. That is then the world of form, if we want to look at it in that context. And there is an evolution. That's how this story is said to have, or what this is a story of, said to be a story of evolution. And at some point, the planet Earth came into existence within that manifestation, within that story. And then life started to evolve, but still no complex instruments through which God could function. So according to this framework, and it's not really important whether it's right or wrong, I would be quite happy. It doesn't change a lot to do with our own personal happiness until animals came into existence. God didn't have an instrument through which to be aware of this creation. A creation not separate from itself, because remember, God, consciousness, source, is described as potential energy that turns into the manifest energy. It becomes the manifestation. But manifestation in the form of energy only, not consciousness. So source becomes form. And at some point, when the form evolves sufficiently to produce instruments, consciousness then also identifies with those instruments and becomes aware of the manifestation. So it's having the experience from our perspective. God's experience and my experience are not two. This is where, I think it's St. John of the Cross, that which we are looking for is that which we are looking for is that from which we're looking from. So it's God in the personal consciousness form going, where is God? Until it realizes and turns inwards, and then the error, the illusion, the separation, the ignorance is no longer. A grounding into our consciousness, the conscious aspect of the human being that doesn't think, the thinking happens. The conscious aspect of the human doesn't create, it is just aware of everything that is happening. And there is nothing in the system at a certain point that interferes, like no thinking that says my doing. The thinking that says my doing interferes with the witnessing. It brings the witnessing into what we could call observing instead of witnessing. And witnessing isn't done by a witness. Witnessing isn't something that is done by an object. Witnessing is the effortless functioning of self, the real self, consciousness that has awakened to the fact that life is essentially a creation, an unfolding according to the story of God, God's will, we could say. Then the working mind, clarity in the body, clarity on a level of the intellect, might realize that the mechanism by which God's will unfolds is through the actions of what we can call, but hopefully we understand what we mean by me and the other. Me and the other that is not separate from life. But how God's will has to unfold is through each of us in each moment deciding and acting a particular way. Now, the word deciding is different to deciding when the attitude of doership interprets the word deciding, because the attitude of doership says, oh, deciding means there is a doer. Whereas decisions are the mechanism by which things happen. It's just that the options that are available and the final, what we call decision, is impersonal. It's happening as a result of these impersonal structures. And so what choosing, not the choice of a doer, but the choice of a biological instrument, decisions are how God's will unfolds. And then from that, at some point, if we call the choice free will in the moment, that simply means that the thoughts, the intentions, and the actions, and the feeling is such that it is my choice. So the movement of the hand correlates with the intention to, let's say, pick up the glass, to have a drink. If our thoughts and the movements of the hands were not correlated, then there wouldn't be a sense of free will. But because there is a correlation, we can say that is what free will means. There is a freedom to do whatever we think or feel to do in the moment, with a deeper understanding that whatever happens is essentially an instruction from something or somewhere that is bigger than the individual. But that doesn't mean we should overlook the fact that in practice there is this, what we could call free will or feeling of free will. Free will and predetermination, they're not opposites, they're complementaries. So if there is a contemplation, and I understand from my own personal experience how difficult it might be for the intellect to put predetermination and non-doership together with free will in the moment, because they seem like they are contradictions. When it becomes apparent that they are complementaries, that is how God's will unfolds in practice through what we call my free will, then we realize God's will and my will are not two, just like my experience of life and God's experience of life are not two. This change in attitude essentially means that the relationship with the other becomes more harmonious. The attitude to the other becomes more an attitude that we could call acceptance, but acceptance is really just the diminishing, the falling away of non-acceptance. We don't really we can't accept. Accepting is not something we can, it's not a function. Just like forgetting, we say, oh, I forgot my keys. You don't ever, forgetting isn't a doing. Forgetting is the absence of remembering. So you can't set out to forget your keys. And you cannot accept. It's not possible to accept. What we might find is that non-acceptance falls away. And by default, when non-acceptance falls away, we find, or we could say, there is acceptance. When there is acceptance, it's acceptance towards oneself, acceptance to the other. It becomes essentially an inclusivity, an understanding that life is a manifestation, a creation. The actions of myself and the other are not separate from the manifestation. They are one with and part of the manifestation. We all have our good points and our bad points. We have our destiny. The other is going to, at times, be part of my destiny, sometimes delivering pleasure and sometimes delivering pain. And it's not personal, especially if we have found, meaning especially if life has delivered changes that allow a grounding into the aspect of ourself that is the non-mechanical, the non-psychological, the true, the real, that which is connected to source. We find that seeing life from this perspective means the simultaneous potential to be that which is beyond life, witnessing life. And from that perspective, the outcomes are less significant. They mean less because they aren't now taken to be an addition or an attack on who I am. So we've become less defined by outcomes as we find ourselves resting in being, witnessing life as a happening according to God's will, witnessing life as a happening arising in the consciousness that we are. And so you might start to get a sense that we started from bottom up, and bottom up doesn't mean only talking about daily life. It is the portal is from the practical to the more esoteric, because they're not really two. And if we were to start from the more esoteric aspect, where I might talk about our nature as consciousness, we are not the body, there is no such thing as manifestation, it's all an illusion, it's not real, we would eventually come down to talking about the practical in a way where it's not dismissed. And in either case, when the two sides of the spectrum are known and there isn't contradiction, then that is what we could call the process of integration. Now, all of this happens. It's not up to you or me as seekers to make life happen. So this attitude can lead to a great relief, a surrender. You don't have to meditate. You don't have to do anything. Just allow life. And really, I'm saying this, understanding it can sound like a complete contradiction. When I say allow life, it sounds like I'm telling a doer to do allowing. It's a description of what might happen. It's not a prescription, not a prescription to allow life, but one day we might find ourselves walking through life with the perspective of seeing everything happen and realizing, oh, allowing has been happening. And in allowing, we find that there is much less resistance, much less animosity, competition, rivalry, anonymity towards the other. There is a softness and openness. And that's why all of these descriptions are put forward, because as they become relevant, as they become part of the investigation, our own personal investigation, they lead to these changes. And so you don't even need to you can't do the personal investigation. We can find personal investigation happening. What does personal investigation look like? It looks like stubbing one's toe and then finding a thought arising. This is pain in the moment. And if the attitude is finding, we see a movement that is a movement of looking for someone to blame for the fact that we've stubbed our toe, then the working mind might come in and go, oh, and that is suffering. That is the attitude of personal doership. That is the attitude of believing that the stubbing of my toe is somehow an attack on who I am. And then a laughing might happen. Realizing if we have started to connect, I exist, regardless of stubbing of the toe. And so if someone, as happened to me one time, you got tenants that didn't pay their rent, didn't leave the house, left the house in a shambles. If that's pain in the moment, and ordinarily we would have suffering that arises simultaneous to the pain in the moment. If we then find that the suffering gets cut off, we realize circumstance is the same. Circumstance is, in this example, painful, and yet no suffering. So it becomes clear suffering is always an attitude to circumstance, that it isn't really an attack on who I am. So then we know that I am what I am is always whole. So that means that there can be a returning to that part of ourself more often, and eventually the suffering no longer arises because there is a familiarity and a connection to source. So it turns out that continuous unbroken peace of mind comes with continuous unbroken connection to source. Not necessarily as a state, but as an attitude, or rather the absence of the attitude that separates us from Source. Thy will be done. That is the realization that we are always connected to Source. And it is from that point of view that the psychological self dissolves and there is peace of mind in daily living. I won't take questions, given that the explanation took the full 2 hours, and hopefully it was comprehensive enough to stand on its own. The recordings of the retreat, there's a series of 10 satsangs that in combination hopefully unfold in a way that a lot of what I was talking about gets elaborated on. So at some point they'll be available, like some of the other intensives that were recorded are available for those that couldn't have made it. And in the meantime, feel free to enjoy the free content on YouTube, remembering that this is just new conditioning that life is throwing out. And one last point, when we have insights, when we find ourselves thinking about the concepts and our thinking elaborates or unpacks it, that thinking is new conditioning. And when we hear a satsang that has the same content, the same sort of content, that is still new conditioning. So new conditioning doesn't mean content I've never heard before. Each time the same pointers are delivered, that's new conditioning being delivered by life. And importantly, the internal thoughts that we might think are, just they're not new conditioning because they're inside, that creates a feedback loop into our up-to-date conditioning. So our own thinking at some point starts to become the new conditioning that that leads to hopefully the up-to-date conditioning and eventually a total understanding.